Welcome back to the last PowerPoint on Islam and the last PowerPoint for the semester. Congratulations, you're almost there. So, in this PowerPoint, I wanted to briefly just look at the major branches of Islam today and how it's practiced in the very broad sense, and then some statistics about the future in Islam in the world, in the U.S. So there are two main branches of Islamic faith. So Sunnis, and that is their symbol, both the crescent moon and the stars, but in different places. Sunnis comprise about 80%, 80 to 85%. Shiites, 15 or so percent of the Islamic faith. Underneath these, of course, underneath these large categories, there are lots of different denominations or groups and various forms of practice, but these are the two major groups. So, what makes the difference? And so it comes down to who is the rightful successor to Muhammad. When I talked about the life of Muhammad, I said specifically that he did not choose a successor, that the community chose that successor for him after he died, or chose a successor after he died, the Ummah, the community, and that man was Abu Bakr. There were the four rightly guided caliphs, the fourth of which was Ali, and after Ali's death, there was a split. So really, whereas the distinction looks back to the beginning of Islam and the death, the actual split did not develop until much later. So they look back, but the split did not occur immediately. So it's kind of a rewriting of history, is in a way, this argument. So what makes you choose, or why would one more than the other? And so since both Abu Bakr and Ali were chosen by the Ummah, the community, and both were part of the original four rightly guided caliphs. The issue is not that; it's about who these men were. So Abu Bakr was one of Muhammad's initial believers. He was an older gentleman who had a great deal of influence on Muhammad, was one of his most trusted counselors, but he was not family. Ali, on the other hand, was family in some significant ways. So Ali was a cousin, but he also was a son-in-law. And he was married to Fatima, the one of the daughters of Muhammad. So remember, none of his sons survived into adulthood, but his daughters did. And then Ali and Fatima had a son whose name was Hussein. And Hussein then is as the grandson of Muhammad, was the only male heir, direct heir to Muhammad. And so really the split did not occur until after the death of Ali. And it was, so that's what I meant when I said the split didn't occur immediately. So the four accepted, but Ali then, so we'll go back to how that occurred, but let's talk briefly about Sunni Islam. So Sunni, remember that the hadith are made up of the sunnah, the various teachings of Muhammad that are very, very central to the practice of Islam, along with the Quran. So they take that name, the ones who follow the tradition, the Sunnah. Whereas there are a lot different denominations within it, there's a remarkable unity in the way Islam is practiced around the world. In general, without getting too deeply complicated by all this. What It's not the practice in terms of the liturgy, the prayers. Um, it is what makes Muslims different are which school of law, interpretation of the law. So remember that the law itself is considered inerrant, um, but the interpretations of the law are not. So they are very much able to disagree about how to apply the laws of the Quran and the Hadith. They do not, however, there are sects within Sunni, but the school of laws are not such. So, Sunni Islam is like I said, about 80 or more percent of all. I don't have this in the slideshow, but 80% of all Muslims claim to be Sunni. Saudi Arabia then is in many ways the center of Sunni Islam, but a lot has to do with the fact that it controls Mecca and Medina. Both cities are in modern day Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia takes on a place in the imagination of Islam that no other place does. And so the role of Saudi Arabia, and so when you start looking at the politics of the Middle East and the politics of these Islamic countries, it's important to know that Saudi Arabia isn't just one of the richest and maybe perhaps the richest Middle Eastern nation, but it controls the very heart of their faith in terms of access to Mecca and Medina. Now, they practice a particular form of Sunni Islam known as Wahhabism, which is very conservative. And so that was in your textbook and one of their words. But Saudi Arabia is one of the major centers of this very conservative form of Sunni Islam, which makes sense given their social conservatism. And so it was only within the past few years that women were even allowed to drive a car in Saudi Arabia. They are very, very, very socially conservative. Egypt then, and this, by the way, is the flag of Saudi Arabia. This is the flag of Egypt, also known historically as a major center of Sunni learning. And so these schools of law, these ways of thinking about Islam are very much they're very much grow out of the Egyptian schools. So these are the two major centers of Sunni Islam. Shia then, literally meaning faction of Ali, believes that the leaders must be biological descendants of Muhammad. So in these images here, I've given you some of the more famous sites of the of Shiite Islam in Iran. So Shia then, small, much smaller, centered in Iran, Iraq, and Yemen. There are other smaller populations along the Mediterranean coast and in Afghanistan, but I'll show you that in a second. So again, and here's the most famous mosque dedicated to Ali, and you're like basically standing looking up. I will note this is about Islam in general, so this is just an artistic note, that in many, many eras of Islamic art, it was considered inappropriate to draw human form. So much of the art of Islam is geometric. So you can see the geometric shapes, or calligraphy. This beautiful application of various scripts with quotes from the Hadith and the Quran. So the combination of geometric and shapes and calligraphy. So that's just a note about Islam in general. So what happened to cause the breach. So after the death of Ali, so you have the four rightly guided caliph. For you back to one of the earlier PowerPoints. But the succession after his death was not as simple as those first four. And the two, one of those who was contesting the succession was Hussein, the son of Fatima and Ali. And two of the contested leaders, or the two individuals who were contesting for succession to Ali, met in a battle in 680, and Hussein was killed. They consider this martyrdom. For Shia Islam, Hussein is not just the grandson of Muhammad, their leader, but the greatest of all martyrs to the faith. And so martyrdom is a very very significant part of the Shia way of thinking. So this focus on the death, and so it tends to be a much more emotional form of and that's a strange word, but in terms of religion, but it is much more based on emotion. The holidays or the festivals that are unique to Shia tend to be ones that sort of, for example, grieve the martyrdom of Hussein. So here's a procession. You can see them all in red, celebrating. So this is a photograph of the mosque dedicated to Hussein, and the martyrs, the festival goers, mourning his martyrdom in the streets as they march to the temple. So again, the biological aspect of it. Their understanding of leadership then is very different in Islam. In Shia Islam. In Sunni, you don't have a lot of professional priests. You have, obviously, there are men who run the masjid. There are imams, and who is and who isn't allowed to lead in prayers. But you do not have anything near the rigid nature of the priesthood in the Roman Catholic and the Orthodox traditions of Christianity, for example. So leadership is much more diversified in Sunni Islam. It is not so in Shia. So the imam then in Sunni is just anyone who is able to lead in prayer in the masjid. Whereas there is only one imam, divinely appointed, descendant, which is a kind of a code word for descendant of Muhammad. And he is then operates a whole lot, to use an analogy, a whole lot more like the Pope than the average pastor. Right, so that as the Pope is to the average church pastor, so is the Shia imam to the Sunni imam, to imam. So there's only one at a time, but without going into a lot of detail, the succession broke down, and there is no one at the moment who claims the title of imam in the Shia religion. So this then has become, and we'll get to this in a minute, a future hope of a return. So no imam in this sense, but in many ways, the ayatollahs that we hear so much about in our political conversations about places like Iran have similar roles to the they're the ones that are taking the place of leadership, and they have much more power than any of the imams in Sunni Islam. So they do then, and this is very much, I think, an outgrowth of the fact that they believe that there is no imam at this time, but they do expect that in the age to come, a descendant of Muhammad, an imam in the Shia sense, will return to earth, and this will bring about the final judgment. So one should think. So he will come. He will be known as the Mahdi, the guided one, or the rightly guided one. He is in the messianic figure of Shia Islam, but Jesus will also be a part of the this return. It's a very the idea of apocalypse or apocalyptic understanding of the end of time. Both Christianity and Islam get this from their dependence on Jewish belief. So Judaism and the biblical Judaism in books like Daniel and the messianic expectations of Isaiah, etc., are taken over into Christianity and applied to Jesus, taken over into Islam and applied in different ways. But in Shia, this idea of the descendant of Muhammad who will return as a messianic figure. Together, they will take the last stand in Jerusalem, and they will defeat the Antichrist together, and Allah will bring the final judgment upon the earth, and everyone will be consigned to the heavens or hells. So it is Sunni versus Shia. Shia tends to be more apocalyptic. I will also make a brief comment about ISIS, which is a wackadoodle version of Islam, and it is in no way representative of any form of either Shia or Sunni Islam, but they are also a very apocalyptic group who, at least at certain points, claimed their leader claimed to be the caliph. Something that has not been seen in a long time either. But there's a really wonderful article that's several years old now about the apocalyptic origins of ISIS in the Atlantic magazine. And if you're at all interested, it's worth finding and reading. You can email it to me and I can get you the reference. You can email me and I'll send you the reference. But ISIS is an apocalyptic group that believes that they are living in the end times and that they are the ones who are going to aid in this great final Armageddon-style battle. It's part of what makes them so very dangerous. They believe that they are the true Islam in ways that we've seen other cults in Christianity claim and do a great deal of harm to the majority of believers, whether they be Islamic or Christian. So just a little side issue on ISIS there. So to continue on talking about the distinction between between Shia and Sunni Islam, here's a map of of countries that are considered majority Muslim and where the Sunni and Shia centers are. So you can see, for the most part, Sunni with the small segments of Shia in Iran and other places. So before you can just go look at this. This is a close-up of that larger map. So it's really fascinating to me that so much of the politics, when we listen to the news, and the Middle East, how much we don't understand about how religion plays a part in it, because we see it, Muslims as this one big blanket with no distinctions, whereas, of course, for them, they are two distinct groups. So you can see that in many ways. So Iran, which, by the way, is primarily Sunni, but also not Semitic. So most of us, you may be aware that this region we know of as the Middle East, that both Jews and Arabs are Semitic peoples. It has to do with language and similarities and historical just deep history. Whereas Iran, we also know it as Persia, was never, it was, they're not Semitic. It's a totally different language group, totally different origins, etc. But you've got Iran then, you've got a major group of Shia Islam in Afghanistan. There's Kabul, which makes it into the news so often. Iraq, some of the major issues that defined the Iraqi war was the idea of a small Shia population. Most of the leadership in Iraq were Shia, but they were controlling a mostly Sunni nation. Yemen, again, is in a major war right now, civil war internally, and also fighting a larger war with Saudi Arabia. I did, and I've already circled it here, but there's Medina and there's Mecca. So we really didn't put those on the map when I was talking about the Hajj and the role of these two cities in the history of Islam. But just to remind you that whereas you could go to Saudi Arabia, this, as far as I know, this entire region, not just these two cities, but the region in between them, are off limits to anyone who is not Muslim. So you whatever visa you can get to go to Saudi Arabia will not get you into that region. You'd have to prove that you are a Muslim, practicing Muslim. So Shia and Sunni, the two major divides within Islam. But there is also one more element of Islam that is not particularly a denomination as much as sort of it flows under the surface. And what I mean by that is that in many ways, Islam it is sort of anti-mystical. Islam does not have a strong mystical element to it. Judaism doesn't really either. You have Kabbalah. Christianity has a deep mystical movement to it. Buddhism has a deep mystical movement to it. But Islam, in general, is more about practice and the law, the Quran and the Hadith. So mystical movements within Islam are often treated with suspicion. The largest of these is known as Sufism. So a couple centuries after the death of Muhammad rose this mystical tradition. The name comes from the fact that they wore these special coarse garments. It's a form of asceticism. Sufism was very much a reaction against the wealth and power that was accumulating to the Islamic peoples as Islam grew and conquered more and more territories in the 100 or so years after the death of Muhammad. But just it is, and then specifically a very, what is it that makes it mystical? Well, it's not just about the outward nature, which you would then understand as being the 5 pillars, the legal interpretations of the Quran and Hadith, but also an inward nature. So one does not just follow, but one to know Allah in a deep, in a mystical way is the goal of Sufism. Sufism love poetry, by the way, is very, very famous, and you've probably heard it in some form or another or seen it in some way. This idea of love poetry that is really actually the soul writing, reaching out to God or Allah. So what does mystical Islam look like? Well, there are multiple orders and groups. They do practice, but they do not live a cloistered existence. So most Islamic mystics will not retreat from society like the monastic movement, for example, in Christianity. but they do then look for the ecstatic experiences. So just again, very influenced by Christianity, but also Buddhist monasticism. So it's a combination of both, because remember that Islam sort of sits geographically. As it moved west, it encountered Christianity. As it moved east, it encountered Hinduism and Buddhism. So this, remember that the idea of an ecstatic experience is to do something to your body in order to alter your mental state. So think about we I talk about this in Christianity 125, but I think we talked about this at the beginning of the semester. Um, the idea of fasting, the peyote religion, use of drugs to alter your mental state. Of course, not really acceptable in Christian or Buddhist or Islamic, the idea of drugs, but music, and all sorts of music and rhythm then probably define the most famous branch of mystical Islam. And you've probably heard of the group known as the Whirling Dervishes, a whirling dervish. So you see these two figures. Notice they have the special hats, and they're wearing these very flowy sort of robes. That was one form of ecstatic experience in Islam, is this idea of dancing in spinning and the rhythm of the music, etc., that will send you into an altered mental state. So this idea, it is not just a pretty dance, it is an attempt to have an ecstatic experience. In many nations, Islamic nations, the dervishes and this particular behavior are outlawed. So you can see it; it's still done under the guise of heritage, right? We practice it, we show the tourists, etc. But it's gone underground, which is again to say the fact that it's outlawed says something about in some nations, is to talk about how Islam is really not receptive overall to mystical Islam or to mystical behavior at all. So this is a very significant but small movement within Islam, and because of particularly the love poetry, it's had a lot of influence on the West. So Sufism. So again, we have the two major branches, Shia and Sunni, with Sunni being by far the larger branch of Islam, but also within it, running under the surface, these mystical forms of Islam that don't really know the boundaries of the Sunni-Shia divide. So, some final comments about Islam. Here are just to give you a sense. I showed you the previous map of the Sunni-Shia divide. This is what are the primarily Islamic countries in our world. So you've got North Africa, the Middle East, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Malaysia. These are the countries that we see as being primarily Islamic. But when you think of it in terms of numbers of people rather than percentage of population, the map shifts a little bit. You still keep Malaysia as as probably the most densely populated Islamic nation in the world. But in terms of just sheer number of people, you see a larger number in the U.S. You see the concentration in Islam in India and Pakistan. It just speaks to how many people live in India. Really, a lot of in the former in Russia. You've got France. And China. And so you do see right now in the news, even within the past few months, an ongoing persecution of Muslims in China, and an ongoing well, and of course, the Chinese government isn't particularly fond of Christianity either. But there have been some reports of significant persecution of Muslim groups in China. But also, India is going through a nationalistic phase right now with a president who is very pro Hindu. So you're seeing some issues with Muslims and Christians in India as well. And so, and then you see a little bit more larger number of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa when you think about it in terms of population. So, the future. And it's really interesting. I might have ended with this study anyway, but it just seems to flow right out of Islam because this is what this was so fascinating about this study. So, in the Pew Research Center published what they call the Future of World Religions Population Growth Projections. What was going to happen to religion between 2010 and 2050? And so this is sort of looking towards the year 2050. And so you can see the overall growth in population of all the major religious groups. Muslims, look at that, almost double. The next group, Christians, Hindus will be growing. Jews, folk religion, very interestingly enough. But this line right here, they're projecting a 35% growth in overall population. So basically, Christianity will maintain the status quo. It will grow with the population growth. So the only religion to increase faster than the population growth as a whole is Islam. So what they're saying really, most religions, that Christianity is going to keep pace with itself. There are, and it's going to happen in two ways. One, birth rates. You know, Christianity, if you are a practicing Muslim, your children are most likely to be practicing Muslims. And at this point, they tend to have larger families. So that's part of it. But the other is conversion. There are two great evangelical or missionary religions, and I'm using this in the larger sense, or in terms of the missionary religions in the world, and they are Christianity and Islam, the two religions that actively go out looking for converts. So Islam is very much on a cusp of having a huge growth. So some more from the this is the last slide, from this Pew Research Fund. I want you to look then, when we look at projected change in global population, that there's a significant difference between the number of Muslims and Christians in the world today. But that distinction is going to narrow and narrow. And so you wonder, after 2050, how soon Islam and Christianity will be equal in size and perhaps even overtake Christianity as the largest religion in the world. It also looks at some of the changes in other religions as well. You can look at that. But I want you also to look at this. Again, that's the chart that we already looked at. The 35% is what they're saying, the overall population growth of the world, and with the 73% then with Islam. But now we break it down. America, we're talking about, they're projecting a 26% growth rate in general, 197% growth rate in North America. There is just so clearly Islam is going to be a major religious force in our country and in y'all's lifetimes without doubt. And it's something we need to take seriously, and we need to really understand who they are, because I don't believe I have any Muslims in the class this semester, but uh, we need to take seriously that this is not the religion of propaganda and certain news sources, and, but it is a genuine religion that appeals to a huge number of people, and we need to take it seriously and know what it is and separate the facts from the myths. Christianity will be growing a lot. Uh, excuse me. Take that back. Islam will surpass in growth rate in sub-Saharan Africa is huge, right? But it will exceed even that growth. The Middle East, it's going to stay about the same. But look at Europe. There's going to be a negative 6 degree, 6% loss of Christians in Europe. The 60% gain. We really speak of Europe as being post-Christian. I think some people are starting to use that terminology for the United States as well. Christianity will grow faster. It will not grow as Islam will not grow as fast in Latin America and the Caribbean. But I wanted to talk about the idea of, why. And I'll end with this idea, perhaps. Look how many, so here again it's religious switching. How much of this is just population growth, and people who are religious have children and raise their children in their own religion, and how much of it has to do with actual people making choices. And so really look, they're projecting that over 60 million people will just choose not to be related to any religion whatsoever. How many people in that group come from Christianity? Christianity it's not as much, to me, as I look at this, it's not so much Islam is growing at leaps and bounds compared to Christianity and gaining new converts. We are just losing people who their families might have associated themselves as Christians, but who are choosing to no longer call themselves Christians anymore. So the percentage net change due to people making the conscious decision to switch religions, pretty distinct. And so those of you who are going into church leadership, in some ways, this is your future, and this is where you need to look and to think. So you guys have made it to the end, and I wish you all blessings on your summer. We have a little ways to go, obviously, to get through the final exam. Thanks for following through to the end. I'm really sad that I didn't get to spend more time with you all. Blessings, and if you have any questions, let me know.